Then I have a few perspectives on economics from outside, and it may be that I just finished that today. That would be wonderful. And by that title, which is also, of course, just putting a few things together, there are some enterprises where economics is analyzed from various perspectives that do not originate in economics itself. This is what I mean. So people looking at economics from outside, like, say, philosophers look at economics from outside when they do philosophy of economics, hopefully knowing enough economics. And these include perspectives. There are many, of course, very, very many of the stuff in this large ocean of heterodox economics are also points of view from outside. They include perspectives from general philosophy of science, from rhetoric of science, and from social studies of science, especially feminist studies. And about these three things, I will say a few words today. Well, about general philosophy of science, I will say rather little, but I mentioned it already in the last lecture. General philosophy of science studies all sciences, investigating their presumed commonalities. Of course, supposing that there are commonalities. And the question is, how thick are they? You know, how interesting are they? And there's been a big discussion during the last decades, how useful that is. There are deep controversies between different philosophical positions that are articulated in this general philosophy of science, and you have heard some of the names, Popper, Kuhn, Lakatos, and so on, Loudon, and some of these things I will also treat here. The question is, the main question that's interesting is that stuff really useful in any sense for economics, right, this general stuff? And there have been several attempts to apply these general positions to economics, hoping then for some deeper insight into economics or helpful methodological hints or rules, whatever. At least people have looked into this, and that should be a part, I think, of any class on philosophy of economics, because you should know of these main positions in general philosophy of science, be they useful or not, just because that is, so to speak, officially some part of philosophy entering economics, so people may mention it in lectures or in articles or so, and then you should have some idea as a successful absolvent of this class here. So in section 2 I will discuss that in greater detail. Rhetoric of economics is a field that I only encountered in this article by Hausman from 2018, this philosophy of economics view, and I've looked at some rhetoric of other fields. It's a subfield of rhetoric of science. It's a very small field existing since the 1970s. I think this is a pity, because it's an interesting field where you can learn something about a science. And it's not philosophy of science, but it's something else. And usually these rhetoricians don't talk to the philosophers and vice versa. The rhetoricians think we can't talk to the philosophers, they are useless. And the philosophers say, well, what they do, we do. And so there's not much interaction. By accident, I did have some interaction with rhetoricians of science, and then I became interested. Now, the first thing is very important, what is meant here by rhetoric. And rhetoric is here not meant in the sense of empty rhetoric, right? How we usually use when you say, oh, this politician uses a very stupid rhetoric here, you know, his wording and so on. But it's meant in the old sense of an empirical investigation in the arguments that are indeed effective in some area, right? So you may, in various domains, you make a rhetorical analysis, meaning analyzing what is the form of the arguments, or what kinds of arguments are successful in a certain area. So it's very interesting, for instance, to analyze certain books with interesting arguments that were, for instance, for 20 years completely unsuccessful, and then suddenly 20 or 30 years later become very successful. The arguments are still the same. And the question is, why were the arguments not successful in the earlier time and very successful in later times? And the same is with some books who have just such an astonishing success. Say in biology, the book The Selfish Gene, or the story of the discovery of DNA. They are books that are immensely successful with millions of copies sold. And the question is, what is the appeal of these books? What is the kind of arguments, you know, how you can somehow touch people, and what is the form, what are these arguments? That's rhetoric. And that's, of course, therefore interesting, because then you can investigate how a science, how a discipline functions by looking at what are the effective arguments, right? So just it's an empirical, you don't judge the arguments whether they're good or bad arguments. You first of all judge whether they are effective in an empirical study. Of course, the other one is then as well that you can ask whether these are really good arguments. And many arguments in science are not logically compelling, so they are absolutely, compelling that you have no way to say no to the arguments. Most of the arguments are not. This is just a human enterprise, but they are still effective in the sense of making a difference. So there are arguments that make a difference and change people's mind, and others don't, and the question is, what is that? Now, it turns out that sometimes there is a gap between official, that is publicly declared normative methodological rules and arguments, and those that are indeed effective in some scientific field. So in other words, you have ideologies for scientific fields, and that happens quite often, such that what people declare, it doesn't have to be bad intentions. It's just people have an old philosophy in their heads, and when they talk about the discipline, then they say something, and if you look closely what they're really doing, then it turns out that's not what they're doing, right? And that happens both in the natural sciences and in the social sciences, economics not being an exception, probably, and I give you someone underwriting this who is innocent, I guess. So this discrepancy between methodological declarations and real actions is well known from the history of science. And just to give you one example that you are probably familiar with, so how often don't we probably also, I don't know it in economics, but in everyday life, that we say, okay, you do not understand a word, and then you say, oh, we have to have a definition. And it's very scientific to have definitions of terms, right? So it seems to be, it's necessary for a good science to have definitions, right? And if you look at the practice of science, then definitions play a very minor role. Not in mathematics. Mathematics is very different. But in the empirical sciences, if you look how the central terms are used, it's very seldom that definitions play a major role. But in the declarations, when you speak about the scientificity of science, then definitions very often play a role. So there is a certain discrepancy what people declare about definitions, and when you look then at the practice, how they are really used. So you look at a fat textbook, and then in the beginning on page 2, there is some definitions, and then if you look at the fate of these definitions in the course of the textbook, and if it's not a math textbook, then the definitions may be of minor significance later, right? So there's a significance, there's a significant difference, and Rhetoric of Economics, in that particular case concerning economics, tries to analyze that and saying, let's not just believe the methodological declarations of the scientists, but let's look at their practice. And as I said, I mean, there's really an innocent testimony here from Albert Einstein from 1933 that has no political context, that date here. If you want to find out anything from the theoretical physicists about the methods they use, I advise you to stick closely to one principle. Don't listen to their words, fix your attention on their deeds. And that's exactly what is the motivation of Rhetoric of Science. Don't just believe the declarations. It's the same when you want to hear, well, I take a harmless example. Someone is able to ride a bike, and if you ask that person, how do you do that you don't fall to one side? And then the person explains it to you. And then you ask, is that a very good explanation of what he's doing? Does he know or she know what she's doing? Of course not. It's a certain practice, and either you can or cannot ride a bicycle, but you don't really know what you're doing. So your descriptions will be rather lousy of what you're saying. The same is, by the way, about many parts in the arts. If you talk with many musicians about what they're doing, I find it sometimes awful what they're saying, even if their music is fantastic. They don't have to describe that very well. That's not their job. And sometimes their descriptions are not so good. And that's the same in many other fields as well, that we can do things. It's the difference there between practice and talking about the practice. And talk about practice may not always be adequate. And that's very important. And Rhetoric of Economics is one of these fields that tries to investigate that. It can also be used, and has been used, rhetoric of science, as a weapon by science critics who suspect that methodological talk in some science is only an empty facade or ideology, and that the discipline functions differently. So this is similar to the criticism that critics of positive economics have when they say it's not really value-free, right? This is ideology. You're just covering up some interests that are there for capitalism or whatnot. And indeed, there are hidden somewhere, there are layers of values. So it's the basic question behind that is that sometimes things are just different from what they appear. So, okay, rhetoric of economics is this field. It's probably not so thrilling. Possibly for some of you, this is more thrilling. Social studies of science, especially feminist studies. And again, who has ever heard of feminist economics in this room? Okay, 1/3 or so. So feminist economics exists. Okay, that's the first good message, whether you like that or not. Anyway, so I show you first what feminist economics is. It's a sub-discipline of, it's not officially so classified, but it is concerning the content. A sub-discipline or something of a large group of disciplines and investigations that's called social studies of science, or sociology of scientific knowledge, SSK for the specialists. And these are studies who try to investigate social factors as opposed to epistemic, rational factors that influence or even determine the content of science. So the background assumption is here that if you look at a certain science, and that can go so far as to mathematics itself, but certainly also biology and also psychology and all the other social sciences, these people say, be careful. It's not that all the results that are produced in this discipline are really the product of completely accurate, rational investigation, data and then hypothesis and so on. But behind that and hidden underneath that is in fact something very different, namely a social influence. So certain interest groups. So if you look at the Marxist picture, then for instance, the science, the bourgeois science is the science of the bourgeois. It's really that class interests, the content of science is determined by the class interests by the ruling bourgeois. And therefore we need, the Marxists say, we need a proletarian science that will then reflect the class interests of the proletarians. The basic idea is that, as I said, the content of science is not just determined by the methodological rational rules, but something unseen, hidden, enters the content of science, which has nothing to do with the, so to speak, descriptive enterprise. That's the basic idea. So it's anti-ideological, it's a critic of ideological, and the ideology, and the point is that different such groups within social studies of science suppose that such influences are there, and they try to uncover them, right? The question is, of course, I think if one looks at that, say, yeah, that's possible. Well, yeah, could be, yeah, show me what is the influence, say, in mathematics? Where do some, whatever influences come in that are not from inside of mathematics, but something social, right? One has to show that. It's very simple. And this is what these people try to do in social studies of science. So, as I said, in this view, the content of science is less the product of impartial, rational investigation of the subject matter than of social conditions. Cancellations of power, for instance. In the Marx case, it's classes. So in more modern, from the 70s, social studies of science is constellations of power. I said the power elites, they determine in the end what is the content of science, especially in the social sciences. So you don't have an impartial description of social reality, but you have really power is reflected there of the ruling classes and shown in the content of science, which is then sold to the public as impartial description of reality. And that's all not true. So it's highly critical, of course, and whether that's justified or not is a question of investigation. One can't say that a priori. There's, of course, some mistrust in science, a distrust in science, distrust in science as a truly epistemic enterprise. And that happens there, and you find that in all the different subgroups of the social studies of science. It's now not that violent anymore. Probably the most intensive one is still feminist studies. It was in strong competition to philosophies of science during the 70s through the 1990s. So for you, this is ancient history. But there was heavy debates between the sociologists of science and philosophers of science, and the sociologists. They said that they postulated a moratorium for philosophers of science, that philosophers of science should shut up for 10 years and not produce this ideology, and now we sociologists, we show what the real truth is behind the sciences. They were not entirely successful so far. Let's see how things develop. Okay. Now, in the case of economics, of course, it's not far-fetched to say that social studies of science try to identify political, ideological, social factors influencing the content of economics. And this is almost, I mean, this is something you're familiar with that sort of criticism. I guess that you say, yes, people think that economics is not impartial, but there are, some social interests, or just the defense of capitalism, or whatever is in there, built into the edifice of that discipline. Now I come to feminist studies. And feminist studies are, in my view here, a specific subclass of social studies of science. So the feminists say there is a certain group that has not the influence that it should have, and they're focusing on the social fact of the high proportion of male scientists where applicable. And that is in economics very clear. You have a very high proportion of males, white males, if you want to add the so-called racial component. This is again a simplified version. I gave these slides to two feminists I know very well in Canada. I sent them the slides, and then one of them said, this is very simplified. The current feminist discussion is much more differentiated, but I stick here to the simplified version for the reasons I gave already. I have to simplify, otherwise it takes too much time. So one can say, as a starting point, look at this academic discipline of economics, and something like 15% of the professors, roughly speaking, or 10 to 15, all over the world as far as I know, there may be some countries where it's different, are males. And it could be the case, I mean, this is a very serious and well-founded suspicion, that it makes a difference that these are all males and that their perspective then invades the content of economics. And shouldn't it be so that we should also look what women have to say, despite their internal differences of all kinds? So it could be the case, and this is, I think, a very plausible starting point for a feminist philosophy of economics, and asking of feminist studies of economics and saying there is a possibility, let's look whether something is there. Yeah, well, I know that apparently. Fundamental worry is then a high percentage of male economists may influence the content of economics in various ways. And there are various ways, topics, just the choice of topics could be that male just typically in a society are interested in other topics than women. For instance, women-related topics. So if you have a strong division of labor between men and women, then women have other jobs, and then males may not be interested in starting the labor market if there's a market for these jobs, right? Household as an example. Or methodology or values or whatnot. So there's everywhere is the possibility of that influence, and therefore feminist studies try to uncover what's there and possibly correct that. So it's extremely controversial and complex. As I said, I'm again giving a very simplified version of it for reasons, and now it's even more complicated. It's non-binary and so on and so forth. It's really complicated, and there's much literature if you want to read that, but I just take out one point that you see what the topic is, and that it's justified to ask these questions. There's a journal, Feminist Economics. It was founded in 1995 by the International Association for Feminist Economics. That was founded in 1992. So in economics, we have something like 30 years of tradition of these feminist studies regarding economics. Then I found an interesting empirical study that I can't read everything, of course, an interesting empirical study by Sheba Tejani from 2019. What's feminist about feminist economics? It did appear in one of the top journals for economic methodology in that journal. And she is simply making an empirical investigation of 490 articles that appeared in feminist economics. So that looks rather impartial if that is done properly, that we can really find out what is feminist economics. and she analyzes 490 articles from the founding of the journal till 2015. And the main result is somewhat sobering. You may have hope. I once spent a sabbatical reading feminist study of all kinds, and I hoped to find some really revolutionary stuff where I say, oh yeah, that's really something I would know. Oh, that's incredible. That's interesting. The main results in that particular case are sobering. Some may love that, others will hate it. Well, feminist studies often aim, for good reasons of course, for the greater visibility of women, for the investigation of the role of power. They broaden the research methods, especially inclusion of non-quantitative methods, which seem to be male. Is that a stereotype? I don't know. So qualitative is female, quantitative is male. Sounds awful to me. May be true, don't know. Anyway, create a more reflexive discipline. So these are some of the motives that people say, oh, look, we should change that, and you see that. These are some of the aims, intentions, sometimes in feminist studies. And the interesting stuff is then, do we find that in feminist economics? You may say, well, this is nonsense, or some stuff is nonsense, for instance, that quantitative male and qualitative female. Anyway, that's a separate question. Now, empirically in feminist economics is a development that is, in a sense, against these basic intentions that may be there. So the author took, I think, I don't know, 3 or 4 different boxes according to years, every 5 years or so, I don't remember exactly. And then she says, what's the development of these feminist studies in the journal Feminist Economics? And what she finds is that the research is more and more empirical and more quantitative. So getting, according to the stereotype, more and more male, right, within feminist economics. A decline in theoretical and methodological research, again, according to this standard, that feminist studies should add reflexivity, methodology, more thinking about how is the discipline doing. A decline in theoretical and methodological research. Empirically, these are empirical findings. Qualitative methods show an increase, but comprise a small proportion of the total number of articles. So you do have some, but implicitly very little. So feminists would hope to have more qualitative methods in economics, but that doesn't seem empirically the case, at least not in the journal. I make one general comment on feminist study. This is just an empirical study I'm just describing. You can read the article to find out what's going on, or you can read the old 490 articles if you have enough time. Now, a general comment is this, that I also discussed with my friends in Canada. What my claim is, and again this is a difficult claim because the term radical turns up here, and radical is by now a technical term in feminist studies, and I'm using it untechnically here. So radical feminists often presuppose that gender inequality results exclusively from oppression. This is what some radical feminists presuppose. They say, if I have some inequality, gender inequality, why is it there? It must result from oppression. Now the point is that this is perhaps not always the case. Apparently different factors may play a role. So for instance, there may be statistically different inclinations of women concerning a motivational, emotional basis, concerning motivations and emotions. And they may have a cultural and or biological basis. This with a biological basis, you are already killed in some feminist circles because biology is out of the game. But in other circles, it's feminist circles, it's in there. But for radical feminists, it's sometimes completely forbidden. So there may be different inclinations of men and women, and there may be biological, there may be genetic or non-genetic. So the brain development in a culture, which is, of course, genetics inputs, but has culture input. Your brain is a cultural brain. Right? That's very important. Many people think biology means genetics. No, Your brain is exposed for 20 years, a culture, and your brain, one can see your culture in your brain with neuronal methods. It's in there. That your mother tongue, it's in your brain. So you're biologically a cultural entity coming from a particular culture, and that of course concerns also the development of those people who are described as males or as females or non-binary or whatever. So that's very complicated, and there are many influences. Then of course the cultural influence, for instance, especially the absence of role models, which I think is one of the most important things concerning universities, why there should be women and it should be reinforced, because otherwise the young women who enter the university say, there are no women, this is nothing for me. Right? And there's empirical evidence for that. In France, it seems to be that there are much more, at least used to be, many more female physicists than in Germany. Why? Because there was a Madame Curie. And she was a role model for women, you know, who became fantastic physicists. Had they not seen the role model, they would not have become that and could not develop that potential. So I think this is extremely important that there are role models. And finally, these factors, and now everything becomes very complicated, may result from earlier oppression. So for instance, the absence of role models of female physicists, say in Germany or Switzerland for that matter, is of course itself a historical product. So it's becoming very complicated. Okay, give me this time 3 more minutes, then I can finish this article. So statistically different abilities may also play a role. It's not clear a priori that females and males have exactly the same abilities. This is not clear. It may be, it may not be. It's a question. It may have a cultural biological basis. And also this is a consequence that the proven presence of such factors may call the 50% postulates for gender ratio in question. So it does not seem to me that from the political agenda of equality of chances for everyone, that this implies a 50% gender ratio for everything, be it companies, whatever. This is a question that must be discussed, I think. It's not clear whether in all cases this is a good idea. And sometimes, of course, it is a good idea. Whatever that you don't get that wrong, statistical differences usually not justify different gender-based access conditions for roles in society. There is absolute injustice to exclude anyone for statistical reasons. Statistical reasons are uninteresting for the individual. If we in our educational institutions want to educate people, everyone should have access who is able to do that, completely independent of statistical conditions. Okay, quick conclusion. Philosophy of economics is extremely multifaceted. I think I could somehow present that. Some areas are closer to economics itself, typically concerning methodological investigations, and we will see that later in greater detail. The contact to moral philosophy is unavoidable in certain areas of normative economics because questions of human flourishing are touched. Clearly, it's about human well-being and then what is a good life. And finally, some areas of philosophy of economics are more remote from economics itself, but may, in the successful cases, produce some insights into what sort of science economics is and how it works. And that is my main goal in this class, that you get some more insights what sort of discipline you are studying here. Thank you very much. I apologize for the delay.